And if one of the things that we've learned over the last 22 months that really screams out to me is the fact that supply chains have to be more agile, they have to be more resilient, but they have to move at a pace because customer behavior has changed so dramatically. And so supply chain can no longer say everything's going to take 2 years. Why are we like that? Why can't we evolve like the rest of the industry?
Following is my conversation with David Warrick. David is Microsoft's Chief Supply Chain Technology Officer. When it comes to global supply chains, not only David is operating large-scale supply chains as a practitioner, but he has such futuristic, visionary, yet pragmatic and relevant to today perspective and vision on supply chains and the role of supply chain in global commerce, change management aspects, business processes, role of technology, different business models. We talk a lot about things from the need for trust, trust deficit, different partnership models within a company, outside a company. David has a very unique perspective on how to make things work. Very practical approach. His humility combined with his knowledge, his expertise, and his forward thinking is just so infectious. I had a lot of fun having this chat with David. You're going to find it so informative, useful, pragmatic. One of the best conversations so far on Algo podcast. And now here is no other than David Warrick of Microsoft. David, sir, how are you?
I am great, Amjad. Thank you so much. Monday morning, so it's always a good time.
Happy Monday morning. No, absolutely. Same here. Now, look, we and our audience, David, we are just so excited to be speaking with you this morning. And I, in anticipation of our conversation, have got some questions as well, which I'll ask as part of our discussion. But maybe a good place to start is you have such pragmatic vision about how supply chains can add value in terms of not only optimizing a business, but industries and ecosystems and, a more sustainable way of using resources. So let's just start with your own story and your passion for supply chain and its roots, a little bit of people to get to know you and your background and how this journey got started for you.
Yeah, it's always a crazy story because when people ask me, why I do what I do, it all sort of fell together. When I first started out, I mean, supply chain didn't actually exist as a competency. So I'm a manufacturing engineer by qualification. I'm also a chartered engineer. My early days, internship with Coca-Cola, the introduction of the 500 ml PET bottle, just to date myself, and a second internship with a very small company. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland originally, and working with a very small building services engineering company. And building services engineering is, if you think about any building, it's everything except the structure. It's the heating, ventilation, plumbing, electrics, all of that good stuff. And this was the, I suppose, I'll call it the early 90s. But they were everything. The traditional drawing office was changing to computer-aided design. And I'd been, studying a lot of computer-aided design in college, and so they asked me to come in as an intern and basically help them set up that computer-aided design department. And I spent, it was a lot of fun. And as I was leaving college, I could have gone either way. I could have gone into manufacturing engineering. But this little Belfast company said, hey, we've just won the contract for the Hong Kong airport. And so if you know the story, in the latter days of British rule in Hong Kong, there was a massive infrastructure project that kicked off. And part of that was to build an airport. And the old airport, Kai Tak, was you flew between very tall apartment buildings onto that runway in the middle of Victoria Harbour. So they were building an island and then building an airport on top of the island. The biggest construction job in the world at the time. And coming out of college, this little company said, "Hey, why don't you join us and go and hang out in Hong Kong for a few years?" And I said, "Well, what's my job?" And they said, "Well, you're going to be a project engineer." And I said, "Well, what's a project engineer?" And they said, "Well, you'll figure it out." And that's basically what I had to do. I had to figure it out, and it was everything from aligning with different, there was 250 main subcontractors on the job, being that coordination engineer, managing logistics, managing installation, every part of it. Just the most amazing experience. And of course, getting to live in Hong Kong in 1995, 1996, it was the party capital of the world. I was a very young engineer on an expat salary. It was fabulous. It was, looking back, it may have been some of the best times, right? But international construction is hard. You were working 12 weeks on, 2 weeks off. You were on site a lot. There was a lot going on. And so I decided that I should try something else rather than spending my life touring construction sites. So I joined Anderson Consulting, now known as Accenture, back in the Dublin office. So came back around the world again. And Anderson Consulting was a fabulous company in terms of teaching you process, teaching you structure, frameworks. It was fabulous. And I got to work in some amazing opportunities with Anderson Consulting, the last of those being with Microsoft. And Microsoft had just gone from in-source to outsource. And at the time, Microsoft really only built those big software kits, Office and Windows, with huge amounts of manuals and disks in them. And so that transition from in-source to outsource just required some re-engineering. And so Microsoft had asked me and Anderson Consulting to come in and help them with that transition. I was doing 2 years of everything. And so as I was about to roll off the Microsoft contract, a new manager had just started who was ex-Anderson Consulting. And she said, "Hey, I'm putting together this team. Why don't you join?" And I was like, "Well, okay, I'll do it for 2 years and then figure out what I want to be." And that was nearly 23 years ago. And so in Microsoft, it's just been a whirlwind. I was project manager designing the supply chain for the first Xbox console over 20 years ago. I've got global responsibilities. I've been part of every launch that Microsoft has made since probably Windows 2000. I've launched every single product. And it's just been an amazing journey to be part of a company that has redesigned itself, rethought itself, re-engineered itself to the behemoth that we are today. So it's been quite a journey overall.
David, also congratulations on your role as the Chief Supply Chain Technology Officer at Microsoft. So that's great. But maybe we can unpack that a little bit in terms of Microsoft's vision of a Azure-enabled, analytics-enabled sort of platform where making it easier for different participants in an ecosystem to share data in a safe, secure fashion, and then to be able to do all kind of interesting things and speed to market and all good things. Anything that you can share with respect to Microsoft's current vision in this space, and then your own role and its scope. I think it'd be great for our audience to hear about it.
No, it's a fascinating time in the industry, and what we realized over the last couple of years is that the general face of supply chain is changing. There's a lot of opportunity. There's never been so much money from venture capital and private equity being pumped into startups who have a relationship to supply chain. It's fantastic for people in the industry because I guess we've been waiting for this our entire journey. We've been waiting for someone to finally say, time to invest in supply chain. And I guess, even when you think about where we are right now, back in 2019, supply chain was just a thing. Now we're the headlines every single day on every news sheet across the world. So we've never been in such high demand, and we've never been so important. Maybe not always for the right reasons, but when you get the spotlight, you got to take it and shine in it. As we've been going through our own transformation, and as we've been looking around the industry, we see the struggle that a lot of companies have in terms of being able to transform. Microsoft with our own cloud, and with continually adding to those capabilities, to me, it always rings true in terms of our company mission, to empower people in business on the planet to achieve more. And I take that very seriously, and I take it to heart in the work that we do. So when I think about how we're continuing to evolve this ecosystem, it really is trying to find these different solutions which are solving sometimes specific problems in the supply chain, and finding the right way to harness those solutions, make them easy to adopt and ingest, and then help them connect to each other and help them create that network, if you like, to allow companies to not always see supply chain transformation as this gargantuan effort that's going to require many years and many millions of dollars to actually be successful. And so in talking to a lot of chief supply chain officers around the world and getting to know some of these companies really well, it just strikes me that there is a hunger to change, and there's also a fear of that change and what it's going to take and how much effort is required, because the traditional approach has been, we've got to go and re-engineer our ERP, we've got to start from scratch, we've got to build it all up again. And my perspective is, I don't think you do. I think that there's a different way to do this. I think you can leverage some of these super incredibly smart solutions that are now on the market. You can leverage big data, IoT, machine learning, artificial intelligence as layers over your legacy systems to actually create the desired outcome. And this is still, I think about it, and you and I talk about it a lot, and we're both members of the Visibility Council and other industry forums where this is such a hot topic. And I think that we're still in our infancy. I don't think this is not a mature approach just yet. We are still in our infancy, and we're still trying to figure it out. And Microsoft has a role to play that we're continuing to evolve. We've got things like Dynamics 365. Obviously, we've got the power of our cloud and Power Apps and Synapse and all of the different elements of the Azure ecosystem, which will be a massive influence in terms of how this actually comes together. But we're still in the forming, norming, storming stage of understanding what that will look like. And at the same time, dealing with challenges from a supply chain perspective that are once in a lifetime. We've never seen this amount of uncertainty from a supply chain perspective, certainly in the 25 plus years that I've been working there.
No, that is the timing is so opportune right now, as you said, to make progress on some of these important topics. And as you said, that the maturity of the industry is still low and a lot of opportunity. Let's, David, maybe for a few minutes, talk about a certain aspect of visibility. in supply chains and transparency from both the supply side and demand side. One thing that I notice is that people have to take efforts from all sides to build trust in your relationships. And how the trust manifests it, or lack thereof, on the supplier side, if there is no trust, then suppliers are, and their suppliers, less motivated to share the information that under proper settings and right kind of incentives can be used to everybody's advantage. But if I, as a supplier, know that if I share information as a sort of, good citizen, it would be used against me. I will lose my POs. It would go to somebody else who is over promising the word and whatnot. So that's one sort of trend that we see on the supply side, that you can have all the wonderful early warning systems and issue management systems, but if the participants are not willing to play that game, there is an issue. On the demand side, there is still a reluctance to share some of the sales data, demand data, inventory data. Colleagues on the retail side of things or the channel side of things, they hold that data near and dear. Now it is opening up a little bit, meaning people have started sharing that data more, but there is still a trust issue both on the demand side and supply side. Would love to hear how people, brands, manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, working with their suppliers, working with retailers, how to build that trust. It was funny, a few weeks ago, I was just talking to somebody in Asia, and they were just sharing with me the following phenomenon. So I'm sure you see or experience the chip shortage issue that we all are facing. And apparently, it's not the specialty chips. Everybody have a process to make sure that whatever their special components are, those components are there. But we all were counting on bread and butter chips and whatnot, and those bread and butter commodity chips are the ones where the shortage is experienced. Due to this lack of trust, and I'm not trying to overly generalize or anything, in this one example, somebody shared with me that, hey, some of this shortage at this point is artificial. It is just a reported shortage. If we are suppliers, commodity suppliers of chips, and we were just treated bad previously, commodity, fungible, and now everybody needs our product, and even though it is short-lived, and if we create some kind of an artificial shortage, we are able to command, bigger prices and whatnot. Suddenly it breaks a lot of, ethics, some legal issues in that comment as well. But here we are more interested in the question of trust. So what are your suggestions on how players can build trust-based relationships and create incentives that keep everybody aligned toward a better goal? I know it's a mouthful and easier said than done, but would love to hear that perspective on such lack of trust or this trust deficit that exists.
I think it's a really interesting topic, Amjad, because again, we've never really seen anything quite like this in terms of the turmoil through supply chain. And so, I think that companies are really struggling on that question of supply and demand. And I kind of look at it and say, the transparency thing is important, for sure. The transparency, it always helps in terms of being able to build that trust. But then there's another part of it, which is consistency. And I think that, you know, a lot of what we try to do with our partners, and it's probably, I really look at the downstream supply chain, so more on the freight and logistics and order to cash cycle. I think what we try to do is we try to be, first of all, very realistic. We try to be practical, and then we are ultimately consistent. And when we're working with our biggest retailers in the world, instead of always trying to have this supply and demand conversation, we actually try and have a different conversation, which is, what are the pain points that you are feeling? Where are the areas where you are struggling right now? And how can we help and how can we assist? So rather than always making it just about the commodity at hand or the specific challenge at hand, we actually try to think a little bit broader about it and say, okay, supply is going to be what supply is going to be. We'll do everything we can, but we're still going to struggle with it. But how can we help you from a supply chain perspective? How can we help make sure that we're getting the right products in the right place that is selling, and we're not just using traditional inventory management theatrics to just put inventory everywhere? So I think that, part of building that trust is actually having that intent to care as much about your partner's business as they do themselves. And even when we work internally in Microsoft, one of the things that we like to be known for as supply chain is that when you talk to any of our partners in any of the channels, be it Microsoft stores, direct to consumer business, or our commercial channel or our retail channel, when you talk to those partners internally, they will tell you that the supply chain team is as passionate about any one of those individual businesses as the people who actually work in them are. And I think that's really important. And when you show up to one of your partners, either be it on the supply side or the demand side, and you're passionate about their success as well as your own, it builds that mutual trust whereby it shows that you're thinking about this in a different way. You're not just in it for yourself, and that helps in these challenging times. Now, it's very easy to turn up and have those conversations and everybody feels good, but they have to be actionable. They have to be, we do voice of the customer surveys, and rather than bombarding our partners every 2 months with a survey, we take those surveys and then we create a what are we going to do differently action list. And then we take that back to the partner and say, we've thought about it, we've taken your feedback, and based on your feedback, these are the things that we think we can do differently, which will actually improve your business and our relationship. And I find that very powerful in terms of building that trust, but also in terms of showing that we're not just in it for ourselves, we're actually in it to improve the entire network and the entire business itself. So I think that's the way that I would go about it and what we try and do today.
What other things, David, in terms of strategies or suggestions do you have for on the visibility topic, visibility and transparency to get better? What ingredients, processes, technologies, any playbook to first assess how good visibility and transparency is in terms of its actionability, and how to get better at that. So any high-level advice for any different angles of visibility?
That's a great question, which everybody asks me a lot, and I think that one of the interesting dynamics in that question is that for so long supply chain has been focused on the lack of visibility, and so it has become the byproduct that everybody thinks that they need visibility, and once they have it, all their problems will be solved. And because I've been on that journey, the first thing that you have to realize is once you have visibility, what problem have you just solved? It's great to have visibility, but unless it's actionable, unless it does something, all it is doing is kind of showing you where you are. And showing you where you are is interesting, but what's really powerful is showing you what's going to happen next. And so I think that in any transformation, there are different levels of attainment, if you like. And when I think about visibility, I think that we've got continually wrapped around the statement as the answer. Once I have visibility, everything will be clear. But what I try to explain to people is once you have visibility, it only gives you visibility, and then you have to define what problem you're trying to solve and what direction you want to take it. And ultimately, from my perspective, I look at it and say, if you've been able to attain visibility, be it in logistics end-to-end or parts sourcing or whatever part of your supply chain or your entirety, inventory management, if you've got that visibility, once you have it, it means that you've gone through certain iterations to be able to bring all of that data together. But then you have to take a step back and you have to ask yourself, what problem am I trying to solve? And what are the actions that I will need to take to be able to solve the problem? Because visibility will not solve it. It will just help you along the way. And so I think that, one of the challenges has been that it has been put on this, ivory tower pedestal that everything will be better once I have visibility.
Yeah.
Everything will have the opportunity to be better once you have visibility, and I think that's to help everybody understand that's it. And then as you're thinking about those solutions and the different opportunities you have with those solutions, one of the things that we do look for is what solution involves pulling that visibility together and then making it actionable, so there actually is a result. And that's one of the reasons we love working with Algo, because it's not just pulling together the end-to-end, it's actually then leveraging that attainment of data to actually do something with it, to create something that will save us time, save us money, and give us a different perspective on the business and add value to what we're doing. And I think that's really important as companies look for those visibility solutions, to ensure that they're not just buying visibility, they're buying actionable insights from that visibility.
Yeah. If you, David, think about as a strategist, somebody who's responsible for strategizing and running supply chain operations, when it comes to talk about capabilities that you would like to see from visibility, from scenario planning, and other aspects of such digital transformation technologies, what are your expectations? What should they do? What should be done, automated? What should be the push and pull? Where should the limited human time go in terms of its creativity and context knowledge? And what sort of things these solutions should be able to do? What are your expectations of that? Hey, in this day and age, today or from a tomorrow's future roadmap perspective, these are the capabilities needed, and they need to connect with each other, because to your point, visibility by itself, it is just untapped potential. It is, it's a starting point, it's an opportunity. But if you are not able to do anything with that, then it is just going to frustrate you, because now you can see a lot and you're not able to do anything. So that's no good.
I mean, I think that traditionally supply chain has been reactive. It's always been about what are we going to do to fix the problem that has just happened. And even some of the best visibility solutions on the market today are still very focused on sensing and responding.
Yeah.
And I think that the future iteration has to be less about sensing and responding and more about anticipation and acting. So it is really swinging the pendulum more towards this predictive and cognitive, because I fully believe that supply chain, from an architecture and systems perspective, it should be a living, breathing, thinking thing. We have more data than we've ever had before. All of the new sensor technologies, IoT, we are gathering signals from supply chain that we would only have dreamed about, even 10 years ago. With all of that data and being able to understand what's happening in real time, we have to shift the mentality, because we've been so happy to live with the ability to just sense and respond. And we've been getting better at that. So rather than waiting today to understand what happened 2 weeks ago to take an action, we're now becoming more real time, which is fabulous, but it's still not good enough. Supply chains are becoming more complex. The customer is becoming more complex. And as a result, you have to be able to build that engine to start understanding all of that real-time data and saying, based on these criteria, I can now predict what's going to happen next. And the supply chain will be able to make these inherent dynamic shifts and movements to enable, and they're acting in anticipation of what's going to happen next. That is the barrier that we need to break through, because traditional supply chain has always been about reacting to something that's already happened. And, if you think about all of the different iterations that we've been going through in the last, 22 months through this terrible pandemic, it's just, everything that happens seems to be a surprise. But in the cold light of day, it's like, well, that shouldn't really have been a surprise. We should have been able to see it. And the examples that I think about are, our logistics visibility solution. Whenever the crisis happened in the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal gets blocked, instead of just focusing on what was on that ship and containers that were going to be impacted, what our visibility solution started to show very quickly was the backlog of other ships that had already left the southern ports of China and were heading to the Suez Canal. So from a visibility perspective, we were, within days, we were able to see that there was already that backlog happening, but none of the software was starting to predict that, okay, the canal will free up eventually, these ships will flow, but the port of Rotterdam has now gone silent because there's been no ships going in, which will then create a backlog in 5 weeks' time whenever all of that traffic goes through. There was no software that was predicting that that was going to happen. But yet, to me, it was kind of the elusive obvious that it was, but you could see it, even on a graphical representation, you could see that the bottleneck was being created, which was therefore going to create a bottleneck somewhere else. And so when I think about, how the technology needs to help and how the technology needs to think, it is about, there's so much social media out there. There are so many different signals. There are so many points of information. How do you aggregate those in a way and synthesize and refine them to start being able to look at, even in the first instance, the elusive obvious and say, a bottleneck here will ultimately lead to a bottleneck over here. We just haven't thought about it like that, and we haven't applied the timing. But in my head, it really is that simple, which is, but we have all of this information. We just haven't figured out how to leverage the intelligence from the data yet.
No, that is so spot on, that figuring out the propagation and impact of these events, and to be able to carry that prediction through, which, to your point, in this day and age, a lot of such data is available, and taking those extra steps and see, well, let's just go several nodes deeper in the network and see how this one choke point is then going to have a cascade ripple, and what does that mean, and how long would that take for this event, this shock, to be fully absorbed, as opposed to just a localized reporting.
Right.
Spot on. spot on in that sense. And I think it also speaks, David, from a machine learning and optimization science perspective, that many times the methods assume that everything is correlated with everything else, if there is a correlation, exactly at that same point in time. And many times there are time delays, meaning, a variable is correlated or has causal links with another variable, but different time steps out. Maybe
Right.
what I do today as a variable impacts some other variable several time steps later. And that thinking is missing from current technology as well. Just in general, they need to get better. How can supply chain teams build better partnerships and relationships with internal IT teams, external providers, and a good way to have those conversations? Today, still, there is a IT-centric architecture, reference architecture that is out there, and many times the way it feels like, since we are, in that space ourselves, I have an ERP system, whatever that ERP system happens to be. Let's try to do everything in that ERP. And if you can't do something, then people start doing that in wonderful tools like Excel, and they do all their work in Excel. They then just upload it in their ERP system. So this whole topic about different digital transformation platforms, whereas you so rightly mentioned that there is so much VC money, innovation money going into these digital transformation platforms. But internally within a company, how to build these partnerships between supply chain colleagues and IT colleagues so that a more pragmatic, less turfy kind of a conversation can happen as to what should an architecture be, as opposed to this notion that we have one system, and while it doesn't do a great job of doing everything, but there is some perceived advantage of one system, which in today's cloud computing era, and the fact that there is all this integration and connectors available from wonderful platforms like Microsoft Azure and many others, it doesn't look like that many of those reasons are practical and whatnot. But it is a challenge that still today, the supply chains, the best software on planet Earth, David, sir, even today, is Microsoft Excel, by necessity or whatever. And then all the work gets done there, gets uploaded then into different ERP sort of platforms. What is your advice on building these internal partnerships, dialogues, so that the architecture and its intelligence can evolve, like an internal trust, an internal partnership thing?
I mean, first of all, I think Excel is a fabulous tool.
It is,
and I think it's carried us through more challenges than we care to admit. And it will continue to be a core supply chain infrastructure piece going forward. I do think the answer is a little bit back to the earlier question, and it is around, if you approach every supply chain problem as a technical problem and always force it to be an architecture discussion, you lose the value in the conversation. And so, we try to approach everything, and we begin with the same question: what problem are we trying to solve? Because technology for the sake of technology doesn't make any sense either. And so with our partners, both internally and externally, we like to talk about the business. We like to talk about our customers. We like to talk about what the challenges are that we are trying to figure out and take that customer perspective, if you like. And I think that is really important. If you don't understand the physicality of what problem we're trying to solve, it's going to be really hard to architect an IT solution around it. And you'll find that those conversations are probably tougher than we want them to be, because everybody wants to jump into solution, as opposed to actually understanding what might evolve from the specific problem. Because even it's not a one-sided conversation, because even when we're talking about the problem from the business context, we tend to be a little bit myopic in terms of the point and place in time. And we don't always think about what's going to happen next, or how that channel is going to evolve, or how the customer will evolve in 2, 3, 4 years' time. And so there's an element of partnership and collaboration, which is, we seem to have sometimes forgotten that it's okay to experiment. The power of growth mindset and failing fast, rather than always trying to embrace the holistic must have, can't fail solution. It's actually okay to bite off different pieces and chunks and iterate on them very quickly, because a lot of the time what I find is it actually helps you get clearer in terms of the problem definition, which is the most important question to begin with. And so trying to get technical teams to understand that iterating is fun, and the speed and agility that enables in terms of the clear definition of the original problem statement is actually a really important part of the process. Writing the 6-pagers and the 30-pagers and the 60-pagers to try and define the problem are super interesting and very traditional. If we are able to iterate in a very quick development cycle, I think that we learn more and we start to hone in on the actual problem that we're trying to solve. But it's a journey. Sometimes that doesn't make sense in terms of an infrastructure perspective, that we have to do something fundamental. But on a lot of the agility questions and the rapid need to evolve, you need to have that agility. You need to think about these things in a different way. Otherwise, it just takes too long. And if one of the things that we've learned over the last 22 months that really screams out to me is the fact that supply chains have to be more agile, they have to be more resilient, but they have to move at a pace because customer behavior has changed so dramatically. And so supply chain can no longer say everything's going to take 2 years. Why are we like that? Why can't we evolve like the rest of the industry? The biggest retailers in the world had to make decisions overnight to be able to stay in business. Supply chain is a big part of that. We have to be more agile. So I think there's some sort of a happy balance in this, which is, it's not just throw everything out and become super nimble, super agile, develop on the spot. There's a time and a place for both types of solution. But as a customer, as a supplier, as an internal IT department, as an external solution provider, you have to find the right mix, and you have to be open to knowing when to go fast and when to be more methodical. And I think that we continue to play this game, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. But I'm happy to see that it's even part of the thinking now. Yeah. That's taken us some time. And our internal IT departments are amazing, fantastic engineering groups to deal with. Our external partners are, just continue to blow my mind away in terms of their rate of adoption, their speed of thinking, and the way that they have completely understood. Just because the initial ask was this doesn't mean that was the full extent of the problem that's trying to be solved. I'm going to figure out what other ways to think about this. It's fantastic. I actually think it has helped accelerate our ability to be different, just because of the way that our partners have really accelerated that thought process. I think it's really driven us in a different direction.
Yeah, no, that is that is so spot on. One thing, this is in fact, David, a question from one of the practitioners, and the question is that sometimes, let me just read it. Sometimes KPIs are not well incentivized, and this person uses, David, an example of OTIF fines that retailers impose on manufacturers or suppliers under certain conditions. Or this other example is lack of transparency on trade dollars spent and compliance. And it's not a complaint kind of a thing. This person's question is how for industry to think about KPIs that incentivize right kind of behavior, and as opposed to creating penalties every which way, create an environment of trust and free up some dollars to go toward innovation and fixing root cause problems versus paying fines or penalties or spending limited dollars in an inefficient way, like a trade spend done in a suboptimal fashion. So,
I mean, it's amazing how all of these topics kind of tie together, because, you know, if you think about it, you know, big retailers implementing OTIF fines, you know, obviously I'm a supplier into retail, so I deal with this a lot myself. And my answer would be that, again, what problem was the retailer trying to solve by implementing them? Because they're not just implementing these fines because, you know, it's Monday and they have nothing else to do. It's because they've realized that suppliers not adhering to you know, documented practices is actually causing pain, from book-in slots being late, to not having personnel at a DC to be able to move product, to disrupting milk runs between distribution centers and outlets because the product didn't arrive at time. Like these things are all related. And again, you know, I look at it and look at some of the relationships that we have, whereby, you know, first of all, we've sat down and walked in painstaking detail through the different steps of the process to understand why we were failing on things like OTIF. And then it was to understand, but why are these fines in place? What is the pain that's being caused from a customer perspective, which is driving them to say, if you don't adhere, I'm going to fine you in that respect. And time again, what we find is different challenges that we can then actually help with. So it was, you know, even if it's things like staging product, drop shipping, all of these different simple solutions that when you're a retailer and you're dealing with a multitude of suppliers, sometimes it's really it's really hard to have 100 different processes and relationships to try and manage those all in the same way. But if, as a supplier, I'm able to step in and say, I understand your pain, let's talk about some things that I might be able to do to help out, and we'll experiment along the way and see where we get to. We've made a lot of progress in terms of being able to, instead of being focused on trying not to have to pay the fine, we've actually switched the focus and said, geez, our partners are hurting. What is it that is making them hurt? What can we do differently to alleviate that? And that goes back to collaboration. That goes back to trust. That goes back to partnership. All of those same things are all wrapped up in this simple concept of understanding what problem is trying to be solved. And so I look on it as, you know, those fines on KPIs are as a result of frustration. Find out what's causing the frustration, and then you can alleviate the fine. Is my simple answer.
Any advice on where I can or should apply machine learning to which part of my supply chain or use cases that you can think of or make suggestions? And then a similar question is, somebody saying that, is there any potential immediate use case for blockchains because I couldn't think of any. And this person is kind of is a long-winded comment, but its essence is that in their company, somebody have told this person that, okay, how come we are not using blockchains to advance agenda without defining problem and whatnot, just getting excited about technology. And this person is saying, it looks like, his comments, not mine, that blockchain in the context of my supply chain challenges of today is a problem looking for a solution. So anyways, so two-part sort of things. One, somebody's asking for your opinion on what kind of use cases or problems machine learning is suited for solving in supply chain, in your opinion? And second, just your high-level perspective on blockchains.
I mean, two great questions. I look at supply chain and go, we are transaction heavy. There is a lot of manual effort required, and there's a lot of repetitive process application. If you read the definition of machine learning, it's kind of geared up for all of those characteristics. So I don't think that there's any one part that I would single out in supply chain. I look at it and go, we are transaction heavy. We are absolutely held back in a lot of ways by the manual processing of those transactions. This is where we are not spending enough time. When I talk about the characteristics of supply chain 2030, a big element that I talk about is the ability to leverage bots, the ability to leverage machine learning to start really tearing down those manual transaction engines and automating it. And this is not in terms of reducing the number of people required to run a supply chain. It's because we are being hit with a complexity which requires a lot more thought processing. And we don't have time to spend on that because we're so tied up with manual transactions. Leveraging machine learning to automate a lot of those manual transactions is going to be an absolute requirement to allow us simply, in the first instance, to free up time to understand the complexities of the supply chains we're now having to run. So I just look at it and say, across the umbrella of supply chain, there is so many transactions that are played. It is the perfect hunting ground for machine learning and artificial intelligence. I mean, like this is where we're still struggling a little bit with this, but the concepts here again are, even if you're sitting on legacy architecture, even if you're sitting with a lot of legacy infrastructure, the modern approach is that the machine learning tools and the artificial intelligence capabilities will layer over your legacy architecture because they're still able to manipulate the data. And there isn't a huge infrastructural change required to enable some, relatively straightforward results from that. But that's a difficult concept for people to get their minds. They think that, well, I'm gonna have to build everything from scratch. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe what you have to do is just layer on a new type of technology which will aggregate and understand and pull the intelligence from your existing bank of data. I think that's a really important concept. But supply chain is the playground for machine learning. We just haven't figured it all out yet. Now, blockchain is a slightly different concept. I do agree with that analogy. I think about it as it's a hammer looking for a nail.
Yeah.
And there are, we ourselves have tried, several different proofs of concept for simple transaction plays, things like freight payment audit, where there's a very clear ledger, double ledger entry. It makes perfect sense. The challenge is to make it really viable, you need that layer of mass adoption. So we've looked at it, for example, in terms of seamless movement of inventory. So from a distribution center to a carrier, from a carrier to a customer, there's a lot of transactions that have to play on both sides. It kind of made sense that, well, blockchain would be a great way of doing that. You would have this perfect record, which would only be closed whenever the next transaction had played. And we set something up, we leveraged RFID, but straight away you start incurring cost, because then you have to RFID label everything. Then you have to build the infrastructure to read those signals. Then the carrier has to have them. Then the retailer has to have them, for them all to grab the same type of signal and be able to then post it to that double ledger entry in the blockchain. Did it work? Yes. Did we solve a problem by doing it? We couldn't think what problem we had solved, which goes back again to our conversation of technology for the sake of technology doesn't make sense unless you're actually solving a problem. Now, does that mean that there is no future for blockchain? No, absolutely not. Blockchain will be an inherent part of supply chain architecture going forward. It's just going to take some time to evolve in terms of the adoption by numerous parties within the entire value chain to make it worthwhile. And I think what you'll see, Amjad, is you'll start to see some of these specific proof of concepts which make a lot of sense, which will then just be added to along the way. And so I think it is, you know, maybe not in my career lifetime, but it definitely, in the next generation, blockchain will definitely play a much bigger role in supply chain.
In general, how important is forecast accuracy and what it is that we should be forecasting? And this person is saying that within their company, there is an emphasis on demand forecasting, as well as forecasting shipments, forecasting retailers' future orders. And sometimes there is an expectation for accuracy to be above a certain level. And this person just makes a comment that, you know, forecast by design is an error minimization exercise, and it is as good as assumptions and data going into it. So the question is, how important for you as a practitioner, or you as a practitioner technologist combination, how much emphasis, resource allocation you think either you put on forecast accuracy or other supply chain officers should put on forecast accuracy, and what should somebody try to forecast in terms of, you know, the pure demand versus shipments versus orders? So pretty sort of, you know, good question, tactical as well. So over to you, sir.
That is a minefield question.
I know.
That's a very tough one, because there are so many different perspectives in the industry in terms of the value of forecasting, what it is, what it should be. I read an article lately that said that you know, when you get forecast accuracy to near perfection, it's around 78% is best in class. And that kind of intrigued me, because my brain went straight to but what about the other 22%? And so I think that look, there has to be a forecasting process. There has to be the understanding of what's going to happen next, just because in any supply chain, you're going to have to understand your purchasing requirement. You're going to have to understand how to align with the lead times that you play with your own suppliers. In terms of the accuracy measure, it's a conundrum. Whenever there are you know, constraints like we see in the current supply chains, how do you then absorb those into a forecasting model and not end up over-indexing on inventory? And I think my mind always goes to at the end of the day, an important part of forecast accuracy is your ability to be agile at the last mile. So how do you weave a postponement strategy or a finishing strategy into your forecasting ability, so that you understand that there's going to be a level of inaccuracy, you understand that the world completely tends to pivot on an axis at any given point of time these days. And how are you prepared to be able to deal with that when it happens? And it goes back to the anticipate and act as opposed to sense and respond. And the ability to think about the volatility that you see in forecast accuracy, understanding what's driving that volatility is important in terms of the retail analytics, understanding buying behavior, understanding what indicators are there or what environmental considerations will drive a direction one way or the other is a science that, again, we're only starting to get our heads around, and there's a lot more can happen there from a definition perspective. But it should not be a blank sheet. It's not a let's try and guess what's going to happen next. No, we understand quite a lot about buyer behavior, and we understand trends, and we understand seasonality. We just maybe haven't understood them to the finite enough level yet to really drive the predictive curve. But in the absence of being able to drive forecast accuracy any higher, you then have to think about, well, how do I be agile around my finished goods? How do I compensate for my known inaccuracy by not being tied in to the very specific piece of inventory that may not be the one that I'm able to sell? And so I think that there's this beautiful, healthy balance of we got to do more from an analytics perspective. We have lots of data, but we've got to start actually thinking intelligently around that data and what it's telling us about buyer behavior, customer behavior, from a day of the week to an hour of the day to a weather pattern assimilated. There's so much that we haven't thought of there. I believe that there may be more answers. In addition, we have to build those forecast models, again, leveraging more data, more machine learning, more artificial intelligence, because I do believe that a lot of the future answers may be in the historical data. And then we've got to build agility into our supply chains to say that we're going to be wrong at some level. It's not good enough for us to say, oh, well, we'll just deal with it. What agile steps are we taking to make sure that we can compensate for any given forecast inaccuracy on a day? I think that's the way that we are trying to get our heads around it, and then building simulation models, understanding what ifs, rather than just always depending on that one signal that we already know is wrong. It seems bizarre when you say it out loud, but that's kind of what everybody does. Everybody depends on a signal that they already know is wrong, and then they get shocked whenever they have excess inventory or not enough. And I think that this is definitely a data problem that should now be solvable, or at least have the ability to improve dramatically on what has historically happened.
Yeah, no, that is so spot on. With respect to David's simulations and what have you, I think this one, as we are getting toward the end of some of these questions. So here is another sort of question on, hey, how shall I set up digital twin properly in my company? So that question is that, hey, how to properly think about this topic of simulation, scenario planning, and digital twins. Any sort of suggestions regarding that?
I think that, again, we've been on this journey, and it's been kind of interesting because we initially thought that this was really simple. You just create a digital twin of your data, and then you're done. It's really easy. What we didn't realize was the complexity of simulation, and I think that our approach has been, we're now going to take different specifics around supply chain, and we're going to create a digital twin for those, and then figure out the types of simulation that we might need to enable a result. Because we were able to look at fulfillment and logistics, for example, and say, if we take supply as a constant, how do we then simulate around optimizing freight or changing mode? And the entire digital twin may be too complex to actually get a good result from that. So we're looking at it saying it's okay to actually build it up in different blocks and figure out some of the peculiarities around each of those blocks, because it is, this ability to create those what if analysis, the ability to play with those numbers is going to be incredibly valuable in each specific part of the supply chain. You don't have to have everything joined together to begin with. It's actually going to take some time to figure each of those pieces out. The other part that we probably didn't realize going into this work was you had to understand the process part of it as well. And we actually started off by creating what we call the process twin, whereby we sat down with a specific set, the order to cash process, and we actually worked through creating a process twin, and we found a huge amount of opportunity even in doing that, in terms of, well, okay, it doesn't matter how you simulate it, because here's your 15 bottlenecks that we will need to solve, that we can solve before we even begin. And so what we thought of was a project actually became a journey. And we were very comfortable with the journey because every single piece of it makes sense, and it allows us to explore and learn as part of that consequence. And so we've been doing some fabulous simulation on fulfillment and logistics, but it's just purely based on last year's data, the year before's data, assuming that everything remained constant. We just said, okay, now we would look at what would have happened if we had done this, or if we had done this, which then allows us to think about how we might change it for next year and the year beyond, or how we might, think about different partners or different capabilities to help us along with that. So it is I think that it's a complex exercise, but very worthwhile. Yeah. But I'm not sure what the end result still looks like. I think I'm still getting my head around what does a digital twin in its full entirety look like, and what will it enable me to do.
So this brings us to our last question. So this person, I saved this question for the last, and the question is, what does winning look like? So as we build these agile, robust, resilient supply chains, how do we know that we are making progress and we are winning? What are some indicators that we are on the right track? I saved that question, David, for the last.
That is a fabulous question. My instinctive answer is, well, if you're still in a job, then you're probably winning. Yeah. So that's I think I'm not sure how to define winning. I think it is if your customers are working with you, if your teams are excited, if your suppliers are engaged, you are in a perfect place. That means that you're continuing to transform, because I don't think there is an end state. I think there is a continued evolution, because there are so many changing variables. And so winning to a certain extent means not losing. But I don't think that it is a state. I think it is a way of being. And if you're winning, you're feeling those relationships, you've built the trust, you're continuing to innovate, you're continuing to evolve, you're enabling revenue and driving profitability, and you're working in an environment where people continually look to change and iterate and improve. I think that's what I would define as winning. And so it's a way of, not an end goal, if that makes sense.
David, sir, thank you for being so gracious with your time. A lot of people are going to take such wonderful insights and actions from this. So thank you, sir.
Amjad, as always, a pleasure. Fantastic questions. Always love having conversations with you. You continue to make me think differently about the industry. Everything that you and your company does is continuing to challenge us and the way that we think about the world. And that to me is trust and a partnership. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for inviting me along this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.